Join me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast to hear fascinating stories every week from the inspiring people behind the science. Today, I am joined by STEM educator, technician, and mentor, Lawrence Dawkins-Hall. Hello, Lawrence. Thank you for joining us on Lab
Delighted
Matters.
to be here.
Very glad to have you. So, Lawrence, we've got quite a lot to get through, but I want to go back to just before you graduated, well, before you went to Bradford,
Yes.
because that's where you graduated from, your first.
Yes.
Yeah. But let's go a little bit before that, maybe to primary stages, and have a little bit of insight into what led you to
That
get
is
to Bradford.
right back. That is right back.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, I think I've always been a little bit of a scientific nerd, and I'm not sure about primary school, but certainly by sort of junior school stage, let's say about 10 years of age. I started to develop an interest in science. I became captivated by scientists on the television. And I suppose,
Anyone in particular?
yes, I was watching David Attenborough programs from sort of quite early on. But I suppose at that stage, there's probably more, if I'm honest, Harriet, but I don't remember. But, oh no, actually there is. Sorry, yes. If I go right back, I remember the being 60 plus. I remember the Apollo missions, and I remember my mother. I must have been only about 5. So yeah, I'll you've sparked a memory. So I must have been about 5, and my mother had an old-fashioned swivel stand black and white television in the corner of the room, as were fashionable then. So it would be about 1970, I guess, because I'd be about 5. It would be Harlow, and I remember the launch of the basically the original Apollo rockets. And actually, I haven't thought about this in a while. One of the things I remember was at that point you used to be able to buy little kits of the lunar modules that landed on the moon. I was always really excited for my mum to send me to the shop. There's a new magazine like Beano came out every Friday, and I would buy the next one in the edition. You build these cardboard, a bit like Blue Peter, these cardboard cutouts that would form the lunar module. And I suppose, thinking back, yeah, that was probably what sort of elicited my interest in science, those Apollo missions.
Mm.
Yeah, and then moving forward, I suppose that sparked it. So quite an early age, actually. I'd totally forgotten about that memory. When I was 5. So I suppose the next thing was when I was 9, I had a teacher, Mrs. Brownbridge, and she had got a B.Ed, but looking back, as we often do when we think back to inspiring teachers, um, I think her major was in science, and we used to do a lot of sort of scientific projects outside. She would talk about the design, futuristic design of houses. So that was science and engineering. I was always fascinated by that. And
Mm.
I suppose that continued into my secondary education. I had Mrs. Brownbridge. I had those early memories of the Apollo mission. And that continued, I guess, into my secondary education. And during my secondary education, I was very lucky to go to quite a good school. And we all think about people who've inspired us. And I was lucky to have some great teachers at this very good school in Lichfield. And amongst others, I had Miss Dawson for biology, Miss Kelly. I had Mr. Ashley, and I had Mr. Meadows for chemistry. And I just remember being captivated by their teaching. They were really, really inspiring. And one thing when I think back to Miss Dawson, I think she was just married to her job. Um, is I look back and I think about these amazing drawings she did during my O and A level biology. It was the days, it was the basically 1980, so it was chalk and talk, to use an aphorism. And she'd do these amazing coloured drawings on the board of the dorsal ventral ganglia and things and the spinal cord. And looking back, not so much at the time, looking back, I remember thinking, wow, that was dedication. She must have been in the classroom 8 o'clock at night doing these damn things because she was teaching all day. And I suppose that sort of inculcated the idea that by the time I think I was about 14, 15, I had this realization that I wasn't just interested in science. I'd already decided, having sort of done my O levels and done exceptionally well in them. And I think there are reasons for that that we can come back to in terms of my neurodivergence. But I decided I was going to just pursue straight A level science, biology, chemistry, and physics.
Mm.
Um, and I had the same wonderful teachers and Mr. Harper for physics. And at that point, I think there was a realization that I would go to university, I would do a science degree, and then beyond that, it was my aspiration, I think, from about 15 to become a professional scientist. But there's a couple more things, I suppose, Harriet, that I could mention that I know
Mm.
I put in the little script to you. One is that in 1978, David Attenborough released Life on Earth. And I've still got this and the little thing from what my mother wrote for me saying, Merry Christmas. And I read this book and I was just captivated by the pictures. It was a wonderful book. I still have it. But I also read a couple of other books. One was The Double Helix by Jim Watson. I was starting to get very, very interested in basic genetics, the Lac-Operon structure of DNA. And I also read a book by a guy called Jacques Monod, who became a colleague of Francis Crick later on, a brilliant molecular biologist who I believe won the Nobel Prize, called Chance and Necessity, that talked about the idea that you have these stereoisomers, D and L forms, and that essentially chance and then subsequent evolution and the necessity of life to evolve based on Darwinian principles, do or die. It had got fixed in terms of the sort of stereoisomer of amino acid, etc. And I remember thinking, wow, this is absolutely mind-blowing stuff. And I'd be about 16, and I remember sitting upstairs and my mother saying, go outside, get some exercise. And I just wanted to sit in my bedroom and study this stuff like a monk. And so, yeah, that was really, I knew that I wanted to go to university. I wanted to be a professional scientist, having left university.
Mm. Did you at that point have any particular area of research that you were intrigued about that you wanted to pursue in study with the idea of it being a career, or was it just?
Yes, I did actually. In fact, funnily enough, and this comes back to what I'll talk about later, is originally I wanted to be a chemist. I used to read this biology stuff, but actually, I think at heart I wanted to be a chemist. It was my strongest subject at school. My chemistry teacher, Mr. Meadows, wanted me to study it at Cambridge, but I realized I wouldn't have passed the general entrance exam back then because I was just a little bit too focused, a little bit too much of a savant. So I decided that I couldn't basically go to chemistry and go to Cambridge and study chemistry. But I did, however, take these things called scholarship levels in addition to my A levels, which were what you sat if at that point. So this would be 83 if they thought that you might. It was a streaming class for Oxford and Cambridge. But during my A levels, I started to read Scientific American, which is still a pretty major sort of popular and high impact publication today. And there was a lot at that point about biotechnology and the emerging biotech industry, insulin production through Gentech. And things like there are a lot of articles on immunology and things like Macfarlane Burnett's clonal selection theorem. So I had a change of heart, and looking back in terms of pure career, and the fact that to some extent working is about putting food on the table. I don't know to this day if I did the right thing, but you're young, you're idealistic. I thought, you know what, immunology is the thing for me. I love this. All these white cells, all the different types of white cells, and the way that they interact. And of course, now it's so much more complex than those sort of network theories that were around then. And so, yes, I decided, I think, at that juncture, Harriet, to not do a straight chemistry degree, which I think from about 13, 14, I wanted to. I wanted to do some sort of biomedical science or biochemistry degree, which is how I ended up actually studying biomedical sciences at Bradford. It was one of the few universities actually at the time. It's very common now, but it was one of the few universities that actually that basically offered that.
Mm.
And I also became sort of through immunology, I became interested in this sort of disease process linked to the sort of immune system, the way it fights it. And in fact, my father, who was a clinician at Oxford, he basically got me working in the biochemistry labs during my summer between my A levels and going to university, and thereafter at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. And so I thought, you know what, biomedical sciences is the degree for me. I want to basically go and work in the NHS. I want to use my science, but I quite like the idea at that juncture. My ideas were evolving of using sort of immunology, but perhaps in a clinical sense. There was a program. I don't know, Harriet, if you know about this, but there was a program with Jack Klugman about a forensic pathologist called Quincy. And essentially, Jack Klugman was this quite fictitious character in the sense that he was a forensic pathologist, but he also seemed to be the detective as well. And I love this. But what I found interesting was I didn't want to be Jack Klugman. I didn't want to be that forensic pathologist. I wanted to be his assistant, Sam Fujiano, who did all the tests in the lab and told Quincy what was going on with the samples he was extracting as he solved the murder. So I realised, no, I really do. I have no desire to be a clinician. I want to work in a lab, but I think I want to do something that's patient focused in the
Mm.
sense that I'm dealing with real patient samples.
Mm. And you've mentioned it a few times now, so we should address it properly. Your neurodiversion,
Yes.
um, was that apparent when you were at Bradford, or did that come to light a few years later?
No, I think when I look back, Harriet, as we all do, I had a diagnosis in my 60s from a consultant psychiatrist who specialized in the area. And that's because we do talk more about mental health now. It's in everyday vernacular and parlance. And I always knew that I was different in some ways, and different in the sense that I had this extraordinary memory for abstract facts, but I was appalling, and I still am, with things, everyday information. So to try and put that in some sort of context, my wife doesn't quite understand it, but I sat my O levels in 1983, and I think if I sat them again tomorrow, I could pass them with straight A's. And that's because I retain that information. But I cannot tell you after 12 years what the street round the corner is. I think it's Queen Street. I don't think it's Market Street. My wife, she pulls her hair. How can you not know that? But it's just so I always knew that I had this sort of predilection to remember odd facts and to remember them well. And an example of that would be at school. I went to boarding school when I was 12, 13. Uh, all the stories you hear about boarding schools in the 70s are true. It was quite a horrible experience in ways that
Which
I'm sure
which one did you go to?
Oh, it was nowhere famous. It was basically a boarding school linked to the school that I was at called Maple Hayes. So essentially, it was living quarters
Hmm.
for the school that I went to. And it was quite a brutal experience. And the idea with this is almost like a Spartan regime that it was character building, as they'd say. It would make you a man, and it was just awful. It was my annus horribilis. It was most people struggle to name the worst year of their life. Mine was 76 to 77. I used to sit in the prep room and say to my mother, why have you sent me here? Um, anyway, my mother relented. We've since discussed it at length, and she said that my original headmaster had wanted me to go there because he felt that the local school wasn't good enough, and I won a local education authority scholarship to go, and that paid my fees, blah blah blah. But anyway, my mother relented. She managed to persuade John Noakes, who was director of education in Staffordshire, to give me a pass. So I used to go on the bus from Burton to Lichfield. But I went off the rails as a result of that happening. Okay, and so a lot of my grades started to drop. There were some problems at home independently linked to a stepfather as well. So it wasn't a great time domestically, and I became a little bit of a rebel, particularly for 1 year. And then when I got to sort of take my options, as they were called, I wanted to basically do geology, physics, chemistry, biology, and lots of other things that were all academic. And I was taken aside by the then head of careers who said, look, you're not academic enough. We think you shouldn't do geology. You should maybe think about art. And I thought, oh, right, okay. And then I'd also expressed an interest in wanting to become a biochemist at that point. And he said, look, Lawrence, we don't think you're good enough. And so I was sort of, disillusioned with this. But then I thought, you know what? You've messed around at school. You've got to buckle down. And I did buckle down, and I started to make extraordinary progress. And this sort of comes back to my neurodivergence. My physics teacher, Mr. Stubbs, about 2 terms before I was due to sit my GCE O levels, I'm showing my age here. I remember the old CSEs and GCE O levels. He said, look, Lawrence, you've come from a CSE streaming. We've moved you up. How do you feel about that? You've got a lot to catch up. And I said, I'm a changed man. I've had this epiphany. I will work like crazy, And he said, well, we did have one individual that came through who's a bit like you. And he got a B at O level. And we thought this was amazing. But essentially, you've got 10 weeks to basically catch up on 2 years' work. And this, I believe, is where my neurodivergence came in, because I locked myself away, apart from meals, like a monk in a cell. For those 10 weeks, I read Abbott cover to cover, like a novel. I managed to retain the information, and I came away with 10 straight A's and my results in the paper,
Mm.
including that A in physics. And they said to me afterwards, wow, Lawrence, we never expected that. And I said, well, I'm not sure I did either, but I did realize that I have this ability to retain strange esoteric facts quite well and struggle with everyday information. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. And I suppose that doesn't necessarily give you a clear path with that knowledge in and of itself doesn't give you a clear path in terms of what to do next.
No, no, no. I mean, I knew I wanted to be a scientist, and to sort of come back to my time after Bradford, I became it's so what actually happened at Bradford was I started to, you asked about Bradford and my neurodivergence. I started to basically, I did really well in my first year. And then I think that some of my OCD and issues related to my anxiety took over. And I'm not to this day sure why. And my studies suffered. Anyway, the bottom line is I was expected to get a first and I came out with a 2-2. And I was obviously really devastated. The problem with that was that to be a scientist, you've got to, back then you'd get a first or a 2-1 and then you'd be streamed onto a PhD program by the MRC, which was first 2-1. I had this 2-2. So what do I do? So I thought, well, I want to be a scientist. So I need to basically go into lab as some sort of laboratory assistant. So I went to Cancer Research UK in London in 1987-88 as a technician.
Mm.
And I realized that at that point, my ideas since have changed, hence the work that I do now, Harriet. But at that point, so this would be about 1990, someone said to me, look, Lawrence, you're really interested in what you do. You seem to have a good grasp of it. You work long hours, which was much more common back then for people to get in at 10 in the morning. But then if you went to labs 7, 8 o'clock at night, most people would still be there. People tend to work office hours today, time and motion, blah, 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 work life balance. It wasn't quite like that back then. So someone said to me, you need to do a PhD. So I had an opportunity as a research assistant on a 5-year Medical Research Council grant to do a PhD. Um, and so I went to the Dunn School of Pathology in Oxford, which, amongst other things, is known for its involvement with Florian Chain in the production of penicillin that, Alexander Fleming down the road, in fact, where I worked before at St Mary's, had discovered it.
Mm.
The upshot is, when I look back, Harriet, I completely messed up. I was only there about 6 months. I'd done really, really well at St Mary's as a technician, and someone had offered me a really good job to head their lab down south, and perhaps that might have been better. But I wanted to do a PhD, so I took this lunge to go to Oxford. Didn't get on with my boss, didn't like the place. At the time, when I was asked to leave, they just said, "This isn't working out, Lawrence," which was terrible. Um, I thought, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I've been asked to leave, so I wasn't going to get a good reference, even though I'd got a good reference from St Mary's, the Cancer Research Institute there, the Ludwig, which had got me into Oxford in the first place. But basically, I'd screwed up on what I wanted to do. So a couple of things happened. One was, so I am a little bit of, I am someone who believes in fate a little bit. So my father, who's a clinician, he said, "Look, Lawrence, I'm working as a nursing manager in this home. While you figure out what you want to do, come and live with me rent free and come and basically work as a nursing auxiliary, as they were called back then, care assistant as they are now, just for a year, just to sort of settle your head down, decide what you want to do, and also earn a little bit of money." So that was a great thing that my father did for me, bless him. And so I started at this nursing home, and I met somebody who 25 years later I married. So I always, when I look back, I always say, you know what? If I'd have finished my PhD in Oxford, I never would have met Caroline. And she's worth a million PhDs. So yeah, it
Enough
wasn't.
said,
Yeah,
exactly.
enough said. Enough said. Yeah. So what actually happened then was I went back to Oxford. I thought, you know what? I sort of failed the first time. So I managed to go back to Oxford, and I knew that I'd always, when I'd sort of worked in the when I'd worked in the sort of research institutes in cancer in London, in particular, I always knew that I enjoyed teaching sort of students and things. And I'm sort of aware of the fact that I'm not the worst communicator in the world. I'm quite confident when I communicate. And so I thought, well, perhaps I should become a science teacher. I loved my old teachers. They were so inspiring. So the upshot is I went and did teacher training in the Department of Education, Norham Gardens, Oxford University, got my PGCE, but then realized, and I didn't know at the time, that my anxiety was linked to my underlying neurodiversity, that I'd have a nervous breakdown if I became a teacher. I remember having placements in school, and it was, and this is true of young teachers. It's about crowd control and getting to the good schools, or just teaching A levels to kids that basically want to be there and learn, is something you get further down the line. And so I thought, well, oh no, I've gone back to Oxford. Um, this is I've got my teacher training, but I realize I don't think I'm going to be able to hack it as a teacher. This is just terrible. I felt like, again, in a different way, I'd failed at Oxford. So I basically went back and lived with my father, went back to Abbey House as a nursing auxiliary, knowing that this was just a sort of temporary thing. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? And during my teacher training, I lived in a university house with somebody that worked in a lab in Oxford, and we'd talk about science and the bench. And I realised I'd still got a passion for that. So I thought, well, I've got to get back into it somehow. But I got a bad reference from Oxford. I got this good one from London, bad from Oxford. So what do I do? So this was 1992. So this would be the summer of 92. And I thought perhaps I can do a period of voluntary work and then work at Abbey House at weekends. So that's what I did. I set up an interview with the then basically chief technician in the biochemistry department at Oxford University. My father lived in a little mining village with his second wife outside of Oxford. And I rang him up and I told him my story. I went in and I was really honest and just said, look, I did screw up my PhD and I just want somebody to give me a chance. So I
Mm.
said, tell you what, he said, we can, you're going to work here. Obviously, we're not going to pay you, but we expect you to come to work at 9 o'clock. There's, no special favors, no dispensation. You'll work like everybody else. And I went back to the lab. So this was 92 and it was it was like a duck to water. I did really, really well, got myself a good reputation. A paid job came up. I took that because I'd got a good reference from the guy whose lab I worked in voluntarily. So Chris Jones gave me a job. It was during the recession, so it was a 6 month contract. So he said, look, we can give you this paid job for 6 months, but that means, Lawrence, after three, you're going to have to start looking. I said, look, I'm just happy to have a paid job and be still in a lab. So I took the job. It went well. I got my name on a patent application from some work I did for him. He was very pleased with me, but the money ran out. But in the meantime, I went to the medical school, the Stopford building on Oxford Road. That was December of 92. And I stayed there until until the summer of 2000. Did really, really well there. Loved my time there. Worked, by the way, as a technician, sort of managing labs, teaching students. Actually got two promotions while I was there. One actually for helping formally teach on a course, which was great because it made me feel like I hadn't become a secondary science school teacher, but I was teaching sort of, albeit technical teaching, to masters and MRes students within the medical school at Manchester University. And the only reason, Harriet, I left there was because um, I became involved in automated DNA sequencing, and this was the time that the Human Genome Project, excuse me, was being sequenced. And I was basically using a streamlined version of what was starting to be used by people like Craig Venter for the sort of draft of the human genome, which came out, I think, in early 2001. And Tony Blair and Tony Blair and Bill Clinton had a big thing. But anyway, what happened was I joined this sequencing forum. I was quite forward back then, and I met up with this guy, George Grills, who said, "Oh, you seem really great, Lawrence. We've actually got some funding." It turned out to be $6 million, so enough to build a bionic man. And he said, "Look, if you come out here." Because things are a lot more flexible pre 9/11. This was pre 9/11. He said, look, we'll see what you like. So I said, okay. I said, if it doesn't work out, George, I've never been to New York. I used to love Cagney and Lacey when I was doing my A levels. I get a trip to New York, not so bad. So I went out and basically I gave this talk about what I did, went well. And then I was taken to see the head of department. He said, look, Lawrence, we'd like you to come back tomorrow and we'd like you to go to HR as well, which is always a good sign. So I had a series of interviews. The upshot is that a few months later, I went back to Manchester. I was offered a job. I went out to New York. I stayed there about 2 years. Sadly, the institute I was at moved from New York to Harvard. I decided at that point to sort of jump ship and go and work for a biotech company based on excuse me, Harriet, the money I'd been offered. Unfortunately, it restructured. This was 2002. Restructured. I got made redundant. No PhD. I'd gone there on an H-1B visa. That's really tricky in America. This was post 9/11. So 100 times trickier. So I had to come back to the UK. That was 2002. I then took a contract in Leicester using that same sequencing technology. I then moved on because it was contract work. So I moved on to contract work in Edinburgh that took me to 2012. Loved it there. Wanted to stay there, but at that point, the person that I'd met all those years before as a nursing auxiliary, she's from Nottingham, where I sit now. She wants to stay here. She doesn't want to live in Scotland. She wants to live in England. Furthermore, she wants to stay in the Nottingham area. So when I went to Edinburgh, it's always been my favourite city. It's one reason I decided to go up there and work at the Roslin Institute. I always thought that I would just retire there, but fate had other things in store for me, Harriet. So I came back here, hooked up with Caroline. We got married. That was where are we? 13 years ago. And since then, I've been working because I need to sort of, by virtue of locality, I need to sort of work in the East Midlands, really. So I actually went back to the original lab in Leicester that I'd left to go up to Edinburgh in 2000 and let me think, five. And I've been there ever since, just sort of carrying on with my research. I do less research now. I'm more involved in the MSc teaching support. But I would say the big thing, to sort of come full circle, the big thing that's happened in the last, 7 years is my involvement in something called the technician commitment.
Mm. And that's part of the Science Council. Do you want to explain that a bit?
I will. I certainly will. Yeah. So I'd at that point I'd gone back into sort of research, and by that point, my sort of faux pas in Oxford were, 3 decades literally behind me. I'd done good work in Manchester and Leicester and Edinburgh since then, so that was well and truly behind me. But I started to become frustrated because I realised, and this was one reason, Harriet, that I did a PhD, because a PhD is really, even today, even with the technician commitment, is still the meal ticket in an academic environment. Okay, it's still the thing that gives you an alternative career structure that, amongst other things, it's not the reason people do it. They have a passion for what they do in science, but unless you've got a trust fund, money is important. You can't say it isn't. It's only rich people that will tell you money isn't important. So you've got to be able to provide for your family. And I started to realize that I wasn't going to go anywhere. Essentially, I'd gone from a certain grade of technician in Edinburgh, and in order to come back to this location, I had to basically take a salary cut by going down a grade, and I was actually 2 grades lower than I was in Manchester in 2000, where I've been promoted twice from the grade I am now. That was in 1998, and we're now 2025. So I thought, you know what, this isn't right. I've been doing this a while now. I consider myself a veteran. This isn't quite right. And I became aware of the work of the Science Council, and sort of independently, people like Kelly Veer, who were sort of promoting the technician commitment through Gatsby and the Science Council. So the first thing I did was I became a chartered scientist and a chartered biologist. And that was really just to validate everything I'd done in a lab. But I thought, you know what? It's nice to have these postnominals, as I don't have a PhD. Okay, this is letters after my name, apart from my basic degree. But I want to become more involved for the sake of not so much me, because we're talking, I'm 60 now, so we're talking somebody in their mid 50s. So, I'm the sort of, not exactly, over the hill, but I'm sort of, at the top of the mountain coming down, I think, to use a metaphor. My best days, I think, are behind me. And I've done some good science since I messed up in Oxford, things I can be proud of in terms of publications and things I've contributed to. But I thought, what about the people coming up? Because it became obvious to me that conditions for those people, compared to sort of when my career took off, which initially I would say was London in the late 80s, we'll forget Oxford, Manchester during all of the 90s, and then those early 2000s in Leicester and New York. I thought things aren't as good today. Technicians, people who are often well trained, well educated, contribute data to papers, but they're not getting their names on papers. And scientists, senior scientists, PIs are saying, well, it's not important to their career. And I think, well, that's besides the point. It's sort of, they've done the work. You've put other people who've done the work on the papers with the PhDs. What about the people without? So I basically started to network with the Science Council and associated licensed bodies like the RSB, and in particular at the start, the IST. And I started to actually talk at their conferences about my experiences as a technician, which were hitherto better early on, and I think had got demonstrably worse, which is why I decided to join this sort of crusade, if you want to call it that, to make conditions better for technicians. And that sort of opened doors, really. It allowed me to do interesting CPD, which allowed me to retain my post-nominals through CPD reports. I got to travel. The IST and the NTDC subsequently, who created a position for me, they'd send me off to technical conferences and still are in different parts of the UK, including Belfast in Ireland. I wouldn't get paid as such, but they pay my travel expenses. And I really enjoyed this. And I think as well, Harriet, it's the fact that not only was I talking to technicians who I felt needed to hear that things were better in the past and maybe by virtue of the commitment would get better in the future. But, I just wanted to sort of spread the good word in that sense. But I also, if I'm going to be honest, I enjoyed the teaching as well. I loved designing course materials online, which I have. I loved standing in front of not a classroom of sixth formers, but young scientists, technical scientists, and chatting to them. It sort of tapped into that desire for me to teach. And I've been doing that really since 2017. I'm just about to have a course that I've designed for the Royal Society of Biology, 4 modules about how to become a chartered biologist, which I am, as well as a chartered scientist. And I might add that the Chartered Biologist Award, the gold standards, I'm sure you know, Harriet, is the chartered chemist. This was the original sort of foray into that area. So everything comes from what the RSC did. But that course is going to go live on September the 15th. And I'm really proud of that because I think, you know what? Here you are. You've got a course. You didn't get your PhD, but you've designed a course for the Royal Society of Biology that's going to go on their website. It's your course. You've designed it. You've basically done a series of webinars. And I have to say, I'm proud of that. And I think finally, after 30 years, I feel, having not gone into the classroom, that through the work that I'm doing for the Science Council, the NTDC, and the online sort of stuff that I'm doing for the RSB, and to some extent the Science Council in the NTDC as well, National Technician Development Centre, this is really utilising that PGCE that I got all of those years ago, but never put into practice in a classroom.
Very satisfying. Really, really interesting full circle of events there that you've just described, Lawrence. And we've got a couple of minutes left. So I just think before we end, I should ask you what your hopes are for what comes next in your in your career.
Okay,
For you or for science per se.
okay. I'm 60 now, so as my wife was saying, your best years are behind you. I'm not exactly ready for the knackers yard, Harriet, but I think I've done my thing. I continue to do my thing through the technician commitment. And there's a dichotomy now. I see really my job as a way of paying the bills. And my passion now is invested and divested into this other work. But I do this other work for technicians coming up. And my hope for them is that through the technician commitment, that conditions can be created that recapitulate what I experienced in the late 80s, early 90s. They get their names on papers again. They get travel grants to go to conferences, as I did. I remember I was paid for to go and basically go down to a cancer research conference at Wadham College in '88, paid for. first experience before I went to Oxford itself of dining at college table, and I want young technicians to experience what I had. But there's another, I think, more insoluble nut here that we need to crack, which is, and even in my day, it was accepted that you needed to do a PhD to get a career. I hope, and there are moves afoot, to create alternative technical career pathways where you can rise through the ranks without going into admin as a technician, which even in my day tended to happen. You know, people to get on had to go into offices, talk to engineers, arrange service contracts, blah blah blah. More sort of structural management than working as a scientist and having a rewarding career with appreciation salary wise as a scientist. That has always been true, if you're lucky, with a PhD. But I think it's never really been true of someone without a PhD. So I suppose my hope is, not for me, but for other people in the next 5 to 10 years, that career pathways will be developed that allow them to rise through the ranks and have a rewarding career where if they want to stay in a lab, they can stay in a lab and they'll get regraded.
That broadening of opportunity. I think we
Absolutely.
can
Yeah.
all support the idea of that. Lawrence, it's been really wonderful having you on. Thank you so much for sharing so much with us. Much appreciated.
My pleasure, Harriet. It's been really nice. And it was lovely, actually, at the start to rediscover that memory about the Apollo program. I'd totally forgotten that as something that happened in 1970. So a dim and distant memory that you elicited.
Indeed. Well, I'm glad I did. Thanks very much.
All right. Bye bye, Harriet.
Did you enjoy that episode of Lab Matters? If you did, please do send it to the people that you think will enjoy it the most.